London, 1888. Imagine gas lamps sputtering in the damp, the streets slick with mist, and a city that pretends not to see what it has built in its own shadows. Because in the East End, in a district called Whitechapel, people weren't simply poor, they were trapped. Alleys twisted like tunnels through a maze of gin shops, brothels, and opium dens. Rooms so small that entire families, sometimes up to 7 people, were crammed inside. Garbage in the streets. Hunger everywhere. And in that desperate world, many women had one brutal option left: sell themselves on the street just to survive. That's where the killer hunted. He moved fast, struck hard, and then disappeared into the fog as if London itself swallowed him. He chose women who were already fading out of society's concern, older, exhausted, worn down by life, and he slaughtered them in a way that seemed not only violent, but purposeful. And then came the message that turned fear into legend. From hell, the package that terrified a city. A parcel arrived for the police, not a rumor, not a threat, but something physical and horrifying, a fragment of a human kidney. With it came a letter describing what the writer claimed he'd done with the rest. The return address was 2 words that sounded like a curse: from hell. London didn't need a courtroom to decide who it came from. By then, a name was already spreading through whispers, and newspaper ink named the killer used himself in earlier taunting letters, written in red ink. Jack the Ripper. By the time that kidney fragment appeared, the police believed the murderer had already taken at least 4 known victims, including Catherine Eddowes, 43 years old, killed after she crossed paths with him in the slum streets. The terror wasn't only in the deaths. It was in what the killings revealed: that someone walked among them who seemed calm under pressure, methodical, and bold enough to mock the authorities. Whitechapel, where the victims were chosen. All 4 women described in the case were prostitutes, not glamorous figures of scandal, but pathetic casualties of poverty, worn down by an unforgiving system. Whitechapel's misery had been easy for polite society to ignore for years. Victorian London didn't talk about sex in public, didn't acknowledge streetwalkers out loud, didn't want to admit that comfort in the West and depended on desperation in the East. But the murders forced the city to look. And once people looked, they couldn't unsee it. Death in the foggy gloom. The first officially recognized victim in this sequence was Mary Ann Polly Nichols, 42. On the night of August 31st, her throat was cut in a grimy alley, and then her killer opened her abdomen with a knife described as roughly 10 inches long. 8 days later came Annie Chapman, known as Dark Annie, 47, already weakened by tuberculosis. She was killed in the same manner, by the same type of blade, with the same cold precision. At first, police tried to keep the fear contained even when people recalled an earlier murder of a Whitechapel prostitute. That earlier case involved stabbing, and investigators didn't see a clear link. The public did. Panic rose, and pressure followed. More police were sent into the district. And outside official law enforcement, ordinary citizens formed their own response: the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, backed by local business interests. Private detectives and volunteers joined in, eager to help, or at least to feel less helpless. But more eyes did not mean answers. The pattern, and the problem. Medical examiners tried to build a profile from what they saw. They suggested the murderer was left-handed and knew a disturbing amount about anatomy. Skilled at removing organs with precision. Gradually, another pattern emerged. The murders tended to happen between 11 p.m. and 4 a.m. But patterns are not a name, and a profile is not handcuffs, so the investigation slid into a darker phase. Authorities harassing and hounding people who fit a convenient stereotype. Petty criminals, known. Sex offenders, butchers. Surgeons with mental illness. The net widened, and caught nothing. Meanwhile, the killer became bolder. The night of 2 murders. Just after midnight on September 30th, Elizabeth Stride, 45, long Liz, was found with her throat cut, but her body wasn't mutilated. The implication was chilling. The killer may have been interrupted. Details made it feel even more haunting and human. She was discovered clutching a bunch of grapes in one hand and sweets in the other, as if she'd been living the last ordinary seconds of her life when death stepped out of the fog. A witness came upon the scene and heard footsteps, but never saw the killer clearly enough to identify him. And then the Ripper did something that turned fear into a scream. Within 45 minutes, he struck again. This time it was Catherine Eddowes. She was killed and disemboweled, and from her body a kidney was removed. The same organ later echoed in that mailed fragment. What makes this moment unforgettable is not only what happened, but how impossible it seems. A busy Saturday night, a crowded slum, extra police, vigilantes everywhere, and still. The killer escaped again. A watchman only yards away heard nothing. The murderer walked off into London's night as if he wore invisibility. Then, for 6 weeks, silence. A royal shadow in the story. During that pause, police pursued what sounded like the beginning of a scandal. On the same night Stride and Eddowes were killed, an officer detained a well-dressed gentleman seen speaking with a Whitechapel prostitute. He looked wrong for the district, too elegant, too composed, too clean. When questioned, the man claimed he was a physician. He spoke well. He convinced the officer to let him go. And as soon as that detail slipped into rumor, London did what it always does when terrified. It invented a monster with a title. Whispers spread. What if the killer wasn't a filthy slum dweller at all? What if he was high society, driven by compulsion and obsession, slumming in the East End under cover of night? For decades, a popular suspect under that theory was the Duke of Clarence, a grandson of Queen Victoria. Newspapers of the era didn't publish such speculation. The Duke's position was too close to the throne. Still, rumors persisted, fueled by claims of his mental instability. Supporters of the theory argued that after the final murder, the Duke was institutionalized and never released. He died in 1892, but suspicion is not proof. And London's most famous unsolved murders have always attracted theories like moths to flame. The most hideous scene. The last officially attributed murder took place in the early hours of November 10th. At 3:45 a.m., neighbors heard screams from the room of Jane Black Mary Kelly, only 24. When the landlord's servant entered at daylight, it was clear the killer had taken advantage of privacy. No rushing, no fear of footsteps in the street. The body was mutilated with painstaking cruelty. Organs were removed. The remains were arranged around the room. This wasn't a quick killing. It was time spent in the presence of death. And then, it stopped. No more official Ripper murders followed. The legend ended as abruptly as it began. The case that was closed, within weeks. Police closed the case without explaining why to the public. But privately, members of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee were told something extraordinary, that the murderer had confessed, and then drowned himself in the Thames. To this day within the story as presented, the supposed suicide confession was never shown publicly, and its contents were never revealed. That vacuum created its own gravity. Many suspected a cover-up either to protect a high-ranking figure like the Duke of Clarence, or to shield a rogue police officer. And then another detail emerged that seemed, to some, too convenient to ignore. A convenient suicide. Montague John Druitt. After the murder of Black Mary Kelly, a suicide was indeed pulled from the Thames. On December 3, Montague John Druitt, described as a struggling lawyer with a fixation on his mother's mental illness, drowned himself. His suicide note, in this account, was never published, and some believe it could have been the confession police referenced when they closed the case. Druitt's background fed the theories. He was from an aristocratic family connected to the medical profession. He moved in upper-class circles. He attended a prestigious boarding school. He belonged to an elite club called the Apostles, whose members came from powerful families. People who knew him said he detested women. Then there's the timeline detail that pulls him closer to Whitechapel. On July 1, 1888, Druitt's mother was committed to a mental clinic. He visited regularly, and according to this account, the route would have taken him through the Whitechapel area to reach her. Over time, he may have feared he was inheriting the same instability. By October, his brother William noticed mental strain and strange behavior. On November 30th, Druitt was abruptly dismissed from his job at a boys' boarding school, where he worked as a physical education instructor to make ends meet. Then, 3 days later, the river took him. So the theory forms its shape: fear of mental collapse, hatred of women, proximity to the crime zone, and a suicide soon after the final murder. But the story doesn't stop there. The apostles and the cover-up theory. Some theorists propose an even darker possibility, that Druitt's elite social circle protected him or silenced him to preserve their reputations. In that version, the apostles used their influence to keep the scandal contained. Perhaps they encouraged Druitt's suicide. Perhaps they ensured it. Perhaps they pressured the authorities to suppress the truth. And that would explain, in one chilling stroke, why the police would declare the case closed without satisfying the public's demand for proof. 5 murders, or 14. The unknown assailant has been suspected of as many as 14 murders, though in this account it's suggested he may have been responsible for only 5 during a 3-month reign of terror. His crimes were associated with blood fascination, and one eerie detail lingers like an afterimage: the idea that he chose his victims so the crime scenes formed a cross on the map of Whitechapel, a signature written in geography. And yet, after all the theories, royals, doctors, butchers, lawyers, clubs of the elite, one truth refuses to die: Jack the Ripper was never caught. Not identified, not arrested, not proven. London, for all its power, could not put a name to the shadow that walked its streets in 1888. And maybe that's the deepest secret of the past. Not that monsters exist, but that sometimes they pass through history so cleanly that even a city watching its own alleys can't stop them.